What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cutlass Board Games channel. We are once again doing a Blood on the Clocktower video where we are building better balanced setups. Now, this time, instead of looking at something like Trouble Brewing, this time I've made a custom script as a follow-up to the last one I recorded, which is the When Can I Show a Librarian 0. Now, now this is a custom script, but you will notice I just have all of the Trouble Brewing townsfolk except for the Virgin, and I've added the Balloonist. For this specific thought experiment, the townsfolk are less important. So I've just put a bunch on there, a bunch of Trouble Brewing ones, because my thinking is for you, a person who is probably starting out as a storyteller and is looking at these kind of instructional things, you are going to be most familiar with Trouble Brewing. And the goal of some of these videos is to help bridge you from being a player who's played to being a storyteller, to then maybe running Trouble Brewing, to then maybe running more advanced scripts, and then trying to get an idea of how these things work. And the When Can I Show a 0 video for the Librarian uses Trouble Brewing, which is not the greatest example because most of the answers is just no. And I'm making a script here, I'll go through it in a second, that will have more scenarios where I think showing a 0 is going to be more advantageous. So let's have a look. We have our Trouble Brewing townsfolk plus the Balloonist, and specifically plus the Balloonist because it gives us the option of having +1 outsider, but also not, which is important. I've picked 4 outsiders that I think are interesting. We have the Goon, because the Goon can become evil, but also a Librarian confirming a Goon can help. Now, if the Goon becomes evil, the Librarian can help convince town to just not pick the Goon, or, corral picking the Goon correctly, which I think is fine. The Minions and Demons, I haven't picked stuff that is likely to turn the Goon evil, which is fine. We're not specifically looking at synergies in the script. I've picked these characters for setting up specific scenarios, which is kind of the point. We have the Lunatic, because the Lunatic is very, very rarely shown to a Librarian. I thought that would be funny and interesting to go over. We have the Drunk, because the Drunk is going to mirror the same problems we have to solve in Trouble Brewing, but we're going to get different and separate circumstances. And we have the Puzzle Master, because I think that the Puzzle Master will do things similarly to the Drunk, but also I'm not sure if it's like a meta in our group, but a Puzzle Master not in play has been more detrimental than a Puzzle Master in play. So I think that is also worth looking at with how that would interact with the Librarian. And then we've got our evil team. There's a whole bunch of clashes here with the outsiders and the Boffin and Demon's Balm. We don't care about that right now. We've got the Godfather, because specifically it modifies the outsider count. We've got the Spy, because it can register as an outsider. We've got the Zaan, because it can change the number of outsiders in play. And we've got the Boffin, because it could give the Demon an outsider ability. It does not make the Demon register as an outsider. It could also give the Demon a Librarian ability, which, I don't know, might be relevant, we'll see. And then I picked 4 demons, all of which have outsider in the text, just Kazali, Vigor Mortis, Fangu, Lord of Typhon. Each of them can modify the outsider count in some way. This would be a fine Stormcourt Librarian script, because there's just so many things that they interact with. And that was kind of the idea. I wanted to, pick out some stuff so that we can try and make things work. And in the previous video with Trouble Brewing, we started at 7 players and we worked our way up to 13. We're going to start at 15 and work our way down to 7. So we'll clear this. Okay. Now let's start off with a random selection of things, and then we'll just kind of delete characters as we go. I think it's going to be a more fun way to do this. Which means Lord of Typhon is probably not a great place to start. So 15 players has 2 outsiders by default. let's start with a very easy and obvious answer. It doesn't really matter who we pick here. What am I doing wrong? I have 13. I have 15. Why does it say 9? Oh, because I haven't picked other minions. I was trying to figure out what my issue was. Okay. This is our 15 player setup. Our Godfather has -1 outsider, and our Vigor Mortis has -1 outsider. It's supposed to be 2 by default. Now we have none. Should the librarian see a 0, or should the librarian see the spy as an outsider? Great, I'm so glad that you verbally answered that at your computer screen. I think this is a really interesting one. So first of all, the Godfather learning which outsiders in play, the Godfather is going to learn nothing. The Godfather here is probably going to have a not great experience, unless so the Godfather's syntax isn't clear if it is specifically the outsiders that you started knowing die, let the Godfather kill. So I would let the Godfather learn the spy as an outsider, so that when the spy is executed, the Godfather will be able to kill someone. If the spy is registering to the librarian, so let's pick an outsider. Let's pick the goon. Let's say the spy registers as the goon to the librarian. I would be more happy to show the Godfather the goon, and the spy goes, the goon's not in play. And the Godfather's like, but I learned that there was a goon in play, and the spy must be, oh, that must be me. Because the spy does not specify to whomst it might register. So a Fangu can pass into a spy. The Godfather can kill at night if the spy is executed, which is fine. And then you can have the spy set up to be, the only outsider. And then they go, it must be Vigor Mortis because there's -1, or it's Godfather, or something like that, which I think is fine. I think this is okay. The other option is the librarian receives a true 0 because there is no outsiders in play. Again, because the Godfather, as a minion, as a person playing the game, probably wants to do something other than removing an outsider from play. That's not really the best use of your ability. The Baron, who arguably actively does nothing, adds 2 outsiders to the game and would be arguably way more interesting and fun to play. But for sake of the librarian being the only play we care about, everyone else, we want them to have a terrible time. We just care about answering the librarian question today. Can we show a librarian true 0? Yes, I think so. I think in this scenario, it would be fine to have a correct 0, especially because you're like, oh, there's 2 outsiders default. I've seen a 0. Either I'm poisoned or it's a Vigor Mortis and a Godfather. And I think that's helpful and useful information. Let's have a look at some other things in this setup. We can also look at this and go, well, we could have the Vig -1, the Godfather -1, and then the Balloon is +1, and then we put a drunk somewhere. If we put a drunk somewhere, the librarian cannot receive a 0. But we put a drunk somewhere, and the librarian sees the spy as something else different. The librarian seeing the spy as a lunatic is really funny. The librarian misregistering off the spy as the lunatic and seeing the demon as the other pick as the lunatic is very funny to me. Having a librarian see the actual demon as a lunatic is great fun. It's incredibly brutal, and unless if players are prepared for such a thing. But also you have to be mindful that, and this happens to me a lot, that players will make assumptions based on the kind of choices that you make based on your history as a storyteller. So something insane, some insane corner worldview shows up, people go, yeah, that's some shit Keith would do. And you're like, well, if that's a thing that the players are going to assume that I'm going to do because it's so crazy, and they go, oh, I'm the librarian that saw a lunatic, and do you think you are the demon? And they're like, yeah, am I just the lunatic? And the librarian's like, yeah. And then you're like, well, okay. But then someone in the town goes, what if they're the real demon? And they're like, oh, well, we should kill them. They're a lunatic. There's no upside necessarily to keeping them alive. We should just kill them and the game ends because the demon got executed. So you have to be mindful of that kind of thing as well. Just as much as you are trying to be consistent as a player, you know, you don't want to act too out at evil all of the time because people would just think that you're evil all of the time. Or you don't want to act too good all of the time, you know. You want to have like a mix. You don't want people to keep them guessing. As a storyteller, you want to be kind of doing the same thing. Having a look, we're going to have a chef 1, the balloonist next to the spies. Fine. We have the Vig. Who does the Vig kill here? Vig killing the boffin is fine. Could potentially poison the monk for value. 1 townsfolk neighbor. What would I show? The washerwoman, you know, all these kind of things. Looking at this, like, okay, what are these reminder tokens I need to add? What reminder tokens I need to think about? What kind of things do I need to add? Let's go -1 down to 14. Let's just remove the mayor for simplicity. So we keep the same minion count, but I'm going to change the Godfather to the Zaan. So Zaan 0 does not work. So let's go. Librarian is the drunk. We'll get rid of the balloonist. We'll play a lunatic. We'll get rid of the empath. We'll play a goon. And it's a Zaan 3. It's a Zaan 3. And so the librarian here has some choices. The librarian could learn the goon, I think is fine. And have somebody else be the drunk in that scenario. Having the librarian learn a 0 here, where it is a Zaan, and the librarian is the drunk, and it is possible to have a Vigor Mortis -1. I think is fine. Some of the thing that you're going to start to appreciate as we dig further into this is that the more control and change over the outside account, the more interesting and useful the librarian's information becomes. Because, and again, like we asked this question in the first video, what is librarian 0 communicating to us? And in Trouble Brewing, 90% of the time, what that communicates is, I am the drunk. Here, when you have stuff like the Vigor Mortis, the librarian receiving a 0 is communicating things like, oh, there's a Vigor Mortis in play. Which I think, you know, works kind of nicely. Like the librarian and the Vig work kind of well in that way. Because there's not really that much else that is minus an outsider. Like there's no townsfolk that is minus an outsider. And I think that would be, you know, a nice powerful addition. A nice powerful addition. Maybe there's a townsfolk that's really underpowered that could use a -1 outsider text added to it. Let's actually change the goon here and make them the puzzle master, and we'll move the drunk to the fortune teller. And then we'll puzzle drunk. It doesn't particularly matter. Now, what does the librarian add to solving the game here? We've got a Zaan 3 still. Let's put the Zaan, my 3. So librarian's going to get information that's unobstructed by the Zaan. Because there is, in theory, another different setup where you could have one outsider in play, like the lunatic or the puzzle master. The Zaan poisons on the first night, and the librarian receives a 0 because of the Zaan, rather than specifically being the drunk. And the librarian receiving a 0 on the first night goes, what if there's exactly one outsider and there's a Zaan? Which I think is also a fine use of the librarian ability, because the librarian receiving a 0, a thing that does not happen very often, the librarian goes, okay, this is very weird and different. What is this telling me? Because the difference between the librarian seeing 2 people that are not outsiders and going and talk to them and then being like, no, I'm not an outsider. And the librarian goes, well, this is all I was told and now it is meaningless. The librarian receiving a 0 goes, what is this information at odds against? Is the player claiming an outsider lying because they are evil? Which is fine, right? Because a lot of the time that person can be executed. It's not a big detriment to the town. You're not sailing the good team up a river. Instead, you go, okay, was I poisoned, or has the outsider count been modified, or is it a default 0? Like, let's go to 13 for a second here. Let's get rid of the washwoman. We're now at 13. Instead, we're going to go to the Fangu, which should give us 1 outsider, which is not the lunatic, which is not the drunk. It is the puzzle master. So the Zan has not added or removed any outsiders here. The Zan has exactly 1 outsider, which was added to the Fangu in this 13-player game, which defaults to 0 outsiders. The 1 outsider added is the Puzzle Master, which is Puzzle Drunk the Investigator. Not as important. However, the Zan 1 now, Zan 1, has drunkened, poisoned the Librarian. The Librarian receives a 0. The Librarian goes, I've received a 0. There is 0 outsiders by default. What does this mean to me? Does this mean I'm the drunk? Because if the Librarian is the drunk in a +1 outsider on a 0 outsiders by default scenario, and then receives a 0, rather than implicating 2 other people as potentially the drunk, is not that detrimental. Librarian goes, well, I received a 0. What is the puzzle to solve here? There is something, for them to determine. And also it might be telling that there is something changing the outside account. There is a Zan in play. There is, something like that. Because in the other options, there's always having the 0 actually and showing the spy as something which it is not, or setting something like that, or the Librarian is poisoned here by the Zan and it shows 2 people as an outsider, which they're not, which I don't particularly like doing. Because that interaction of going and talking to them and being like, hey, are you this thing? And they're like, no, is not fun. And the Librarian seeing the drunk between 2 people is way too common and is actually worse for the good team than you think. Because either the Librarian is the one that is the drunk, and the other 2 people's information is not trusted by the town, or one of the other 2 people is the drunk and is shown by the Librarian, but unless if you as the storyteller give them really bad information to help confirm that they are the drunk, the other person seen in the Librarian thing is also going to down all of their information. So you can potentially remove up to 3 players from being able to contribute to a worldview with just a Librarian activation doing that. I would only do this in an 8-player game of Trouble Brewing where it's like maybe a spy, or a 7-player game with a spy and one of the players you want to make think that they're drunk, or an 8-player game with a spy and they're drunk, and then the Librarian is trying to help confuse people. But it's still, I think doing that and also having a poisoner is way too powerful. Maybe if it was a Scarlet Woman, because the Scarlet Woman interacts less with ruining the good team's information. So maybe that's the scenario. It's an 8-player game. You have the Scarlet Woman, you have the Librarian that says drunk between 2 people, which I think is fine. I think most of the times that I have seen it, it's been way more detrimental than it has been helpful. Whereas here, if the Librarian sees a Puzzle Master between 1 or 2 people, goes and talks to them and goes, yeah, I'm the Puzzle Master. Librarian goes, great, I'm not the Puzzle Drunk. -1 person to the list of people you need to check. Which is helpful, but also does confirm the Puzzle Master is not an evil player that's trying to, again, send them up the river. However, also showing the spy instead as the Puzzle Master. Let's pretend the Puzzle Master's not here. Showing the spy as a Puzzle Master gives the spy a lot of power to destroy the game. So you have to really keep in mind is when you're false registering something, how much damage it truly can do to the good team. The spy being a really good example of this, because they know everything. They can make the best possible choice to ruin the good team. But let's reset this a bit. We're going to go down to. I might change the button to to be the Godfather again. So we're down to 12, which is 2 outsiders by default. The Godfather has -1, and we have the Puzzle Master. And let's change the Fangu to be the Khazali. The Khazali, for some reason, selected Godfather and Spy. Now, the Librarian knows that there is one outsider in play and could only show the Puzzle Master or show the Spy, which I think is fine. The Godfather -1 so that there is 1 instead of 2 outsiders, I think is okay, especially when it is a detrimental outsider like the Puzzle Master. Or like the drunk. Like if the Godfather knows that there's just a drunk in play and they've removed an outsider to do that, I don't think it's terrible. With the Godfather, I think balancing can be really hard, especially if you are choosing the minus, because it feels like they're, hurting their own team, whereas a +1 is like always better for the evil team. But you're like, okay, the cost is there's 1 less outsider, but I picked the worst one that we have on the script for you or something. And then the upside is supposed to be that the Godfather knows which outsider is in play, and then knowing that it's the drunk isn't very helpful for them. Knowing it's the Puzzle Master is slightly more helpful for them, and so you've got to try and consider, how is it interacting with that. And I know I've talked a lot about the Godfather in this episode, but when you are changing the outside account, the thing that changes the outside account and how that interacts with the Librarian is going to help tell you, do I have a 0 outsider set up? Is that fine and fair? Is the Librarian receiving a 0 in that scenario actually helpful to the good team? Because most of the time, the Librarian receives a 0 and they don't, use that to engage with solving the game. Oh, okay, I got nothing. Whereas the evil team coming out with outsider bluffs and Librarian goes, I got a 0, prepare to die, I think is slightly more interesting, and trying to set up those kind of scenarios I think is more interesting. With this one, you are stuck seeing the Puzzle Master. However, if we swap these things around, let's make it the Boffin again, and we will go to the Riga Vigor. So the Vigor is now minusing the 1. We have the Puzzle Master. We also have the Spy. So the Spy could potentially register as a second outsider here. We can have the Puzzle Master and the Goon wouldn't be terrible, because in theory the Goon can be a public outsider. And again, this script is a weird script and not for playing but for looking at. Problem. If I had another different outsider that's like fine with being public, like the Butler or the Recluse or whatever, showing the Spy as that, and then also in the Puzzle Master being there, both of which can be pretty public, confirms the outside account as 2 is the default, and the Vigor -1 is going to go under the radar, and Vigor Mortis is going to be hidden a little bit better. It might become a little bit obvious if the Vigor Mortis kills the Spy. But what are the other things? Let's do a little C shuffle. We've been looking at the same stuff quite a bit. Not that changed a whole lot. So we're at 12. Now let's go down to 11. So 11 is going to be 1 outsider, and the seat that we're going to remove is the Puzzle Master. There is now no outsiders in play. The Vigor Mortis has removed the 1 and only outsider in play, but we still have the Spy as an option. Do we show a Librarian 0? Well, what are the other things we have to worry about here? Is interesting. There's like pretty much no scenario where I want to boffin onto the Vigor Mortis, the Librarian. What the investigator sees here is really rough. I think I just have to show the boffin between 2 people. The chef, I'm definitely not going to pick the Spy with that, so it's going to be a chef 0, which might hurt a lot actually. I think the monk is fine. The monk is likely to die early. The fortune teller or the undertaker are likely to die before that. The Vigor Mortis in theory could kill the boffin to poison the storyteller, the fortune teller. Yeah, poison the main storyteller. Poison the fortune teller instead of killing them, which is bit better and less likely to tip off that there is a spy in play. It's unlikely the Raven Keeper will die. And we have the Slayer literally next to the Vigor Mortis. So, what's the greatest value in the Librarian seeing a 0 here? The Librarian seeing a 0 goes, okay guys, either I am the drunk, no one else's information can be incorrect, because or it's specifically a Zaan 1, and then one of the evil players bluffing as an outsider is legit. Or I know that there's no evil players that are genuinely the outsiders they claim to be. They must be evil, they cannot be an outsider. There's no Puzzle Master drunk, all that kind of stuff in play. And also it has to be Vigor Mortis because it's one outsider default. So suddenly, this setup, the Librarian goes, I got a 0. What does that mean? Oh man, there's like 5 different things it could mean. They're engaging with the game and they are trying to solve something. And it's something that has likely never happened to them before. Librarian 0 is not a super common thing. So it happens to them, you go, bam, there's no fucking outsiders in play. And they're like, what does this mean? Which I think is really interesting. And that is the kind of experience you're trying to distill with this, strange choice. I don't think that there's many scenarios where you really do want to be showing a Librarian 0, but if you can cook up something like this, like the Vigor Mortis is a really cool. I think it's much better than the Godfather for this specific scenario. Having the Spy potentially can also give you options, and it communicates something interesting. I think the Zaan and the Vigor Mortis, having both of them and the Librarian and going, okay, when is the good time to show a 0, I think is really interesting. Because we can go Zaan, and then the Zaan, we're going to change this. We're probably not going to do Puzzle Master. We're going to do Lunatic. Is Lunatic a funny option here? Okay. So, this is the setup. It's a Zaan 1. The Zaan says, all townsfolk are poisoned until dusk. Librarian receives bunk information. The chef here does not get a 2. The chef here, I would give a 1. In a scenario where this is the setup and the chef is poisoned for the Zaan, I give the chef a 1. The fortune teller gets a yes on literally whoever they pick. I'm fine with that. Ravenkeeper is unlikely to die here unless it's randomly picked by the Fig. No way, it's first night, so it won't be killed. So the Ravenkeeper is unaffected by this. The Undertaker is unaffected by this, and the Monk is unaffected by this, right? So it's just these 3, which is the big ones. But Librarian receives a 0 from the Zaan's poisoning. There's a Lunatic in play, which is a very hidden outsider. And then if the Lunatic at any point goes, guys, I figured it out, I'm the Lunatic, the Librarian is very unlikely to believe them. But also, the Librarian is very unlikely to figure out that that's the case. This specific setup with the Vigor Mortis minusing 1, I think the Zaan can just override that to say that yes, there just is one. It doesn't matter. Like the outside account is irrelevant. So it's not specifically a problem, but you could have this with any other demon, it doesn't matter. And then there's this cool tension between the Lunatic and the Librarian and the demon, which I kind of like. I think that, is a much more interesting setup. I think the Zaan does lend, the Zaan 1 does lend to some interesting, Librarian 0s. The Vigor Mortis does lend to some interesting Librarian 0s. But I think that's kind of it. The Librarian 0 with the Librarian is the drunk, or, has been selected by the poisoner, and there is outsiders in play, mostly in Trouble Ring, isn't great. I think the scenario where the Zaan does this because the Zaan can change the outside account, and if the Zaan has added only 1, and there's exactly 1, which would poison the Librarian, and it's a very hidden outsider, I think that works. And I think the Vigor Mortis can also work as well if you're expecting to have 1 and instead there is 0. So here are some things for you to consider when it comes to playing with the Librarian. I felt like my previous video was inexhaustive because it just looked at Trouble Brewing, when there's a lot of other characters that will give you scenarios where a Librarian 0 is actually kind of cool and interesting. I think that was worth exploring. Now, the point of this video series, I've come back to it after a long break. I want to start doing more kind of storyteller tips kind of videos. I think going forward, rather than picking a script, like looking at Trouble Brewing, like I did an advanced setups for Trouble Brewing, which I think went pretty well. But I think maybe the way to go forward is to pick a particular character and a particular scenario, and then try and look at all of the times where it is a good, a good choice to show this thing or a bad choice to show this thing. Because, for example, if you're playing Legion and there's 9 Legion and the chef gets a 15, you're like, I am poisoned. The storyteller hates me. It's Legion. And you really don't want the storyteller hates me to be a thing that your players are thinking. So I like being able to consider and look through all these things. And look, if it was helpful to you, please let me know. I'm looking to do more of this kind of video series. And if there's, specific characters that you want me to look at and interactions that you are curious about, let me know. Like maybe next time we delve into what's the best pairing for the evil twin to be, or something like that. And we'll go through and look at what some of the options are. Because I like doing this kind of stuff, and it's pretty straightforward for me, but hopefully it helps you learn a few things. And if you're interested in, taking this journey further, checking out some of the other stuff, I will have a playlist up on the screen, which is going to have specifically all of the Bloodline Clocktower setups videos. I do have a whole nother different playlist, which has just all of the Bloodline Clocktower content that we do on the channel, because we do other stuff as well. We do Let's Plays, we've done a couple of ARPG Let's Plays, we played through the entire Aperscape trilogy. I do kind of generic game design advice stuff. It's what I do for a living. I make games. And so I sometimes will, as an act of professional development, look at other games and some of the choices that went into making them and their design, part of, how I interact with Clocktower. So I have some of that stuff up on there as well. And, maybe go and check all of that out. But don't forget, hit that subscribe button, because it does help a lot. My goal is to get to 1,000 subscribers this year. And I'm doing a video every single day until we hit that goal. So clicking the button helps me a lot, but also there's so many Clocktower videos scheduled and coming soon. So stick around, because we're going to have a lot of cool stuff for you to explore.